What if I told you that one of the most effective weapons of the 20th century wasn't a tank, a plane, or even a bomb? It was invisible, it could travel at the speed of light, and it could invade 1,000,000 homes at the exact same moment. This weapon was the radio wave, and the war it fought was for the most valuable territory on Earth, the human mind. Welcome to 10-Minute History. I'm your host, Jake Sullivan, and today we're diving deep into the psychological war, exploring how words and images were forged into weapons of mass influence that shaped the modern world. Before the 20th century, influencing the public was a local affair. A king might build a giant pyramid to show his power, or a general might parade his spoils through the streets of Rome. But the Industrial Revolution created something new. Huge cities filled with millions of people, a literate public, and mass circulation newspapers. Then came the First World War. This wasn't a war fought by professional armies on some distant field. It was a total war, a conflict that required the complete mobilization of entire nations. Suddenly, public opinion wasn't just a concern, it was a critical front. Governments realized they had to sell the war to their own people. Britain was the master of this new, dark art. Secretly, in a building called Wellington House, the government gathered the country's best writers, men like Arthur Conan Doyle and H.G. Wells, to create propaganda. Their masterpiece was the narrative of German barbarism. When Germany invaded neutral Belgium, British propagandists seized on stories of atrocities, both real and fabricated. They called it the Rape of Belgium, painting a picture of monstrous German Huns bayoneting babies and crucifying prisoners. In 1915, they released the Bryce Report, an official-looking document that presented the most shocking rumors as verified fact. Released just days after a German U-boat sank the passenger ship Lusitania, it had a devastating impact, cementing the image of Germany as a depraved, savage nation in the minds of the world, especially in the neutral United States. When America finally joined the war in 1917, President Woodrow Wilson faced an isolationist public. His solution was the Committee on Public Information, or CPI, run by a journalist named George Creel. Creel called it the world's greatest adventure in advertising. His artists created iconic posters like the stern Uncle Sam pointing his finger, with the words, "I want you for U.S. Army." His most ingenious creation was the 4-Minute Men. This was an army of 75,000 volunteers who would give short, 4-minute patriotic speeches in movie theaters and churches across the country. They delivered over 7 million speeches, bringing the government's message directly to the people in a personal, compelling way. In contrast, German propaganda was clumsy and arrogant, and it failed to counter the powerful Allied stories. But the most important piece of German propaganda came after the war. It was a lie. The Dolchstoßlegende, or the stab-in-the-back myth. German military leaders claimed their army was never defeated on the field, but was betrayed by traitors at home, socialists, pacifists, and especially Jewish people. This poisonous lie would become a central belief of a new political party rising from the ashes of Germany's defeat, the Nazis. The First World War had created the modern propaganda machine. But in the 1920s, a revolutionary new technology would hand the master manipulators a tool beyond their wildest dreams. That technology was radio. Suddenly, a leader's voice could bypass all gatekeepers and speak directly into the homes of millions. It was intimate, immediate, and it could be centrally controlled. Franklin D. Roosevelt mastered it with his, quote, fireside chats, using his calm, confident voice to reassure a nation gripped by the Great Depression. But while Roosevelt used it to build trust, others were studying how to use it to control. Thinkers like Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, essentially invented the field of public relations. Bernays believed you could engineer consent by appealing to people's unconscious desires. In one famous stunt, he wanted to break the taboo against women smoking in public. He hired models to march in a New York City parade, lighting up cigarettes as torches of freedom, successfully linking smoking to the powerful idea of feminist liberation. These new techniques, and the power of radio, were about to be perfected in the totalitarian laboratories of Europe. In Italy, Mussolini cultivated the myth of Il Duce, quote, the tireless leader. But it was in Nazi Germany that propaganda became the very essence of the state. The architect of this machine was a man named Joseph Goebbels. A brilliant, cynical, and ruthless manipulator, Goebbels was appointed by Hitler as the Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda in 1933. He believed his job was to create a new reality. He operated on a few simple, terrifying principles. First, keep the message simple and repeat it endlessly. Second, appeal to emotion, not intellect. Stir up love, hate, and fear. Third, use the big lie. A lie so colossal that people will believe it, because they can't imagine anyone would have the nerve to distort the truth so infamously. And finally, create a single unified enemy to blame for everything. For the Nazis, that enemy was the Jew. Goebbels seized control of all newspapers, films, and art. But his favorite weapon was radio. He promoted a cheap, mass-produced radio called the Volksempfänger, the People's Receiver. It was deliberately designed with a weak signal, making it hard to hear foreign broadcasts. Radio ownership skyrocketed, and Goebbels made sure everyone listened. Loudspeakers were installed in factories and public squares. When Hitler spoke, sirens would blare, and the entire nation was forced to stop and listen to his hypnotic, hysterical voice. Goebbels also used film, hiring director Leni Riefenstahl to create Triumph of the Will, a cinematic masterpiece that transformed a Nazi rally into a religious epic, with Hitler as a godlike savior. He also produced vile anti-Semitic films like, quote, The Eternal Jew, which intercut images of rats with footage of Jewish people to dehumanize them completely. By 1939, the weapons of the mind were fully forged. As the world plunged into the Second World War, this psychological battlefield went global. The airwaves became a war zone, a cacophony of competing voices. From Germany, the most infamous voice belonged to a man known as Lord Haw-Haw. His real name was William Joyce, an American-born fascist who fled to Germany. Every night, his sneering, nasal, upper-class English voice would begin his broadcast with the chilling words, "Germany calling, Germany calling." He would mix real news of Allied losses with taunts and lies, trying to create an atmosphere of paranoia and despair in Britain. He became a sensation, a figure of both morbid fascination and intense hatred. In the United States, his equivalent was Axis Sally, an American woman named Mildred Gillers who broadcast propaganda to GIs, playing sentimental music to make them homesick and then telling them their girlfriends were cheating on them. But the Allies fought back with their own arsenal of voices. Britain's greatest weapon was the BBC. Unlike Goebbels, the BBC adopted a radical policy, tell the truth. By accurately reporting on their own losses and setbacks, they built immense credibility. So when the BBC announced an Allied victory, people across occupied Europe believed it. The BBC also launched the iconic V for Victory campaign. The opening notes of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, which matched the letter V in Morse code, ... became an auditory symbol of resistance broadcast across the continent. And then there was the defiant voice of Winston Churchill. His speeches, broadcast by the BBC in the dark days of 1940, were masterpieces of defiance. He never downplayed the danger, but he wrapped it in language of such courage that he transformed a desperate situation into a heroic struggle, uniting the British people with his words. But the British also fought with lies. A secret unit ran, quote, black propaganda, creating fake German radio stations. The most famous was run by a man named Sefton Delmer. His station pretended to be hosted by a patriotic, old-school German officer who was disgusted with the Nazi Party's corruption. This fictional officer would rant and rave, mixing real news with scandalous, made-up stories about Nazi leaders to sow discord and drive a wedge between the German army and the party. It was psychological warfare of the most cynical and brilliant kind. The Second World War was the peak of the radio age of propaganda. But as it ended, a new Cold War began, a twilight struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. The battlefield was now the entire globe. Winston Churchill said an iron curtain had descended across Europe, and the West's primary weapon for piercing that curtain was radio. The United States funded Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. These stations were staffed by journalists who had fled the communist bloc. They acted as a, quote, surrogate free press, broadcasting banned literature, playing forbidden music, and reporting on news that the state-controlled media suppressed. They were a lifeline of truth to millions living behind the Iron Curtain. The West also used culture as a weapon. The Voice of America's Jazz Hour, hosted by Willis Conover, became legendary. To listeners in the Eastern Bloc, the improvisation and individualism of jazz was a powerful symbol of freedom. The Soviets fought back by jamming Western signals and mastering the art of whataboutism. When criticized for their gulags, they'd say, "But what about racism in America?" It was a tactic designed to create moral equivalence and muddy the waters. This psychological war lasted for more than 40 years. It ended not with a military victory, but with an information victory. By the 1980s, the lies of the Soviet system could no longer hold back the truth that had been broadcast for decades. The fall of the Berlin Wall was a physical symbol of a psychological barrier that had already been broken. So why does this history matter now? Because the battle for our minds never ended. It just moved online. The core principles of propaganda are timeless: appeal to emotion, simplify complexity, repeat the message, and demonize an other. But the delivery mechanism has changed. The one-to-many broadcast of radio has been replaced by the many-to-many network of social media. Propagandists no longer need giant transmitters. They can use troll farms, bots, and viral memes. Today, algorithms create echo chambers that show us only what we already believe, making us more susceptible to manipulation. We now carry propaganda machines in our pockets, and the big lie has been replaced by a tsunami of disinformation that leaves us cynical and unsure of what to believe. The lesson from the psychological wars of the 20th century is that a free society requires constant vigilance. The responsibility to be critical consumers of information, to seek out different perspectives, and to think for ourselves has never been more important. The voices on the airwaves have changed, but the war for our perception of reality continues. So what are your thoughts on this? Let us know down in the comments below. If you found this interesting or learned something new, please give this video a like, and don't forget to subscribe to 10-Minute History for more deep dives. Thanks for listening.